The old Haverson farm had seen better days, though Martha wouldn't admit it to anyone who asked. The white paint on the main house had long since surrendered to the prairie wind, leaving behind weathered gray planks that groaned with every gust. The barn, however, still stood proud, a massive red structure that her grandfather had built in 1947 with his own calloused hands and the help of neighbors who believed in the old ways of community and mutual aid. Martha had inherited the property 3 years ago when her uncle passed, and with it came 200 acres of stubborn soil, a tractor that ran on prayer and spite, and enough debt to make a younger woman weep. But Martha was 53 and had weathered worse storms than financial uncertainty. She'd buried a husband, raised 2 children who'd fled to the coasts as soon as they could drive, and survived the kind of loneliness that comes from being the last person who remembers how things used to be. The Quonset hut had been her secret project, her small rebellion against the slow decline that seemed to have settled over her life like dust on unused furniture. She'd found it listed online, a military surplus semicircular metal structure that some contractor in Iowa was practically giving away if you could haul it yourself. Martha had driven the 8 hours in her pickup, paid the man $300 in cash, and spent 2 weekends disassembling the corrugated steel sections with a determination that surprised even herself. But here was the thing that would have made her the talk of the county if anyone had known. She didn't erect the Quonset hut out in the open like a sensible person would. Instead, Martha had spent an entire month clearing out the center section of her grandfather's barn, hauling decades of accumulated hay bales, broken equipment, and mouse-infested furniture out into the autumn sunshine. Then, piece by piece, she'd reconstructed the Quonset hut inside the barn itself, a silver cocoon hidden within the wooden shell. Her nearest neighbor, Tom Peterson, would have called her crazy if he'd known. The folks at the feed store would have shaken their heads and muttered about eccentric widow women with too much time and too little sense. But Martha had her reasons, even if she couldn't quite articulate them to herself in the quiet hours before dawn when she lay awake wondering if she'd finally lost her mind. The Quonset hut became her sanctuary. She insulated it carefully, running electricity from the barn's main line, installing a small wood stove she'd found at an estate sale. She furnished it simply, a cot with warm quilts her grandmother had stitched, a reading chair she'd roof-upholstered herself, shelves for the books she'd been meaning to read for 30 years, and a small work bench where she could lose herself in the delicate work of refinishing old furniture she found at auctions and yard sales. It was her place, separate from the main house with its memories embedded in every creaking floorboard, separate from the relentless demands of the farm that seemed to want more than she could give. Inside her hidden metal haven, Martha could be someone other than the widow Haverson, the last of a dying breed, the woman people pitied at church socials. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, the first snows had already painted the fields white, and the radio weatherman's voice carried that particular tone of concern that made people stock up on bread and milk. Martha had gone through her usual preparations, plastic sheeting on the windows of the main house, checking the propane tanks, making sure the tractor had antifreeze and the generator had fresh fuel. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving, the sky took on a color Martha recognized from childhood, a peculiar yellow-gray that seemed to press down on the earth like a hand. The wind had a voice that afternoon, not the usual whisper through the bare branches, but a low moan that seemed to come from the ground itself. Martha stood in her farmyard, hands stuffed deep in her coat pockets, and felt the first stirring of real unease. The radio that evening spoke of a historic storm system, 2 massive fronts colliding directly over the Great Plains, the kind of weather event that got capital letters in news reports. The blizzard, they were already calling it, with the breathless excitement of meteorologists who'd been waiting their whole careers for something like this. Visibility would drop to 0, temperatures would plummet to 30 below, possibly 40 with wind chill, and it would last not hours but days. Martha moved through the house mechanically, filling pots and the bathtub with water in case the pipes froze and burst, gathering flashlights and candles, checking her supplies of food and firewood. But something gnawed at her, an instinct she couldn't name. The house suddenly felt too big, too drafty, too full of places where the cold could creep in through cracks she'd never been able to find and seal. Around midnight, when the first fat snowflakes began to fall and the wind started to scream in earnest, Martha made a decision that would have seemed insane in daylight. She grabbed her heaviest sleeping bag, threw clothes and supplies into a duffel bag, filled a cooler with food, and made 3 trips through the increasingly violent weather from the house to the barn. The barn shook with each gust of wind, but when Martha pulled open the door of her Quonset hut and stepped inside, sealing it behind her, the howl of the storm became a distant thing. The curved metal walls seemed to embrace the fury outside and transform it into something almost peaceful, a drumming rhythm against the steel that spoke of shelter rather than threat. She fired up the wood stove and watched the temperature gauge climb. The barn's outer walls provided a windbreak, and the Quonset hut's design engineered to withstand the worst weather military bases could throw at it, created a remarkably efficient space. The curved shape shed wind like water, and the insulation she'd so carefully installed held the heat like a thermos. By dawn, when Martha peered out through the small window she'd installed in the end of the structure, the world had disappeared. There was nothing but white, not falling snow but horizontal walls of it, driven by wind that must have been hitting 60 or 70 miles per hour. She could barely see the barn doors 20 feet away, just ghostly shadows in a universe that had been reduced to chaos. The radio, running on batteries, told horror stories. The interstate was closed, trucks jackknifed and buried. The town 15 miles away had lost power completely. Rescue crews couldn't reach people, even those in trouble, because visibility was literally 0, and the drifts were already 6 feet high and growing. 3 people had been found frozen in their cars, having made the fatal mistake of trying to drive to safety. The governor had declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was mobilizing, but even they were grounded by the conditions. Martha listened to all of this from inside her cocoon of steel and insulation, sipping coffee heated on the wood stove, warm and safe in a way that seemed almost miraculous given what was happening. Beyond her walls, the main house, she knew, would be an icebox by now. The furnace was good, but it was old, and in cold like this, with wind like this, it would be fighting a losing battle. The windows she'd tried to seal would be leaking cold air like sieves, and the floor would be so frigid that no amount of running the heat could compensate. But here, in what would have seemed like the worst possible choice, a metal structure, for God's sake, metal that should conduct cold like a wire conducts electricity, she was genuinely comfortable. The barn's wooden walls broke the wind, and the Quonset hut's engineering and her careful insulation did the rest. It was like being inside a ship, she thought, a vessel designed to ride out any storm while keeping its passengers safe and dry. The blizzard raged for 3 days, 3 days during which the world outside ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Martha read books she'd been saving, worked on refinishing a small oak table she'd been restoring, and discovered that solitude, when you're genuinely safe and warm, is a different thing entirely from loneliness. She had time to think, really think, about her life and what she wanted from whatever years remained to her. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the wind simply stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence was so profound that Martha's ears rang. She ventured outside, opening the barn doors with difficulty because the snow had drifted nearly 4 feet high against them, and stepped into a transformed world. The sun was breaking through tattered clouds, and everything, every fence post, every branch, every surface, was sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind and snow. The beauty of it struck her breathless, but so did the danger. The drifts were enormous, some easily 10 or 12 feet high. The path from the barn to the house was completely erased. The house itself was nearly buried on one side, snow piled against it like a breaking wave frozen in time. It took Tom Peterson 2 more days to dig his way to her place with his plow, a journey of 3 miles that should have taken 10 minutes. His face when she opened the barn door to his knocking was a study in relief and confusion. "Martha, thank God," we thought. "When we couldn't see any smoke from your chimney, no lights, we feared the worst. The whole county's been trying to account for everyone, and we couldn't get through to check on you." She invited him in, and his jaw literally dropped when he saw the Quonset hut nestled in the barn's interior, smoke curling cheerfully from its small chimney pipe that vented through the barn's roof. "What in the name of, Martha, how long has this been here?" "Few months," she said, unable to keep the small smile from her lips. "Built it myself." Tom walked slowly around the structure, taking in the careful construction, the insulation, the way she'd vented it and run electricity. He poked his head inside and saw her little sanctuary, warm and dry, a pot of soup still simmering on the wood stove. "You rode out the blizzard in here. Seemed like the sensible thing to do when it started. House is too drafty for weather like that." Tom shook his head slowly, then began to laugh, a deep belly laugh that echoed through the barn. "Martha Haverson, you're either the craziest woman in 3 counties or the smartest. I'm leaning toward smartest. Do you know half the town lost power? People were huddling in emergency shelters, burning furniture to stay warm, and you're in here like you're on some kind of camping trip. Word spread, of course. In a county where everyone knows everyone else's business, there was no keeping a secret like this. People came to see Martha's hidden hut, and their reactions ranged from puzzlement to admiration. The younger folks, especially, seemed to get it. The tiny house movement, they called it, the idea of a small, efficient space that you could heat and maintain without breaking the bank or your back. But it was the old-timers' reactions that surprised Martha most. Men her age and older, farmers who'd spent their lives working the land, would stand in the barn and study her handiwork with an appraising eye. More than one nodded slowly and said something like, "Smart, real smart. That's old thinking, that is. Like how we used to cluster the animals in the barn to share heat in winter. Use what you have. Make it work double." Martha's daughter called from Seattle, having heard about the blizzard and her mother's unorthodox survival strategy through the family grapevine. "Mom, are you okay? I heard you were living in some kind of metal shed in the barn." "I'm fine, honey. Better than fine, actually." "But Mom, don't you think it's time to maybe think about selling the farm, moving into town where there are neighbors close by, where you don't have to worry about storms and being isolated?" Martha looked around her little sanctuary, at the books on her shelves and the projects on her workbench, at the space she'd created for herself with her own 2 hands and her own stubborn will. "No," she said simply, "I don't think it is. Spring came eventually, as it always does. Martha kept her Quonset hut, though she spent more time in the main house once the weather warmed. But she'd learned something about herself during those 3 days of the blizzard, something about resilience and adaptation and the quiet satisfaction that comes from solving your own problems in your own way. She started taking in boarders during the winter months, people who wanted to experience what she'd created, who paid her good money to stay in her hidden sanctuary and feel what it was like to be genuinely safe from the world's storms. Artists came to work in solitude, writers seeking quiet, people exhausted by modern life who needed a few days of simplicity. The farm, for the first time in years, began to pay for itself. More importantly, Martha had found something she'd thought was lost: a sense of purpose, of pride, of being someone who could still surprise herself and others. Tom Peterson, stopping by one afternoon to help her fix a fence, surveyed the now tidy barn and the smoke rising from the Quonset hut's chimney where a young couple from Chicago was spending a long weekend. "You know what I think, Martha." "What's that, Tom?" "I think you didn't hide that hut inside the barn at all. I think you built yourself a life inside a life, a safe place inside the place you were supposed to be, and I think that's about the smartest thing I've ever seen anyone do." Martha smiled, watching the spring wind ripple through the new grass in the fields. Maybe he was right. Maybe the Quonset hut had never been about the storm at all, but about creating a space where she could weather the quieter, more persistent cold that comes from loss and loneliness and the slow erosion of purpose. The blizzard had proved her engineering was sound, but she'd proved something more important to herself: that it was never too late to build something new, to adapt, to find shelter not just from the weather but from the harder storms life throws at you. And as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Martha Haverson walked to her barn, content in the knowledge that inside its weathered walls was a small miracle of steel and determination, ready for whatever winter might bring next.